Walter Wallace came from a large family. He was one of 13 children. Walter went to a local school, which was the predecessor of Fortismith School in Muswell Hill, which is still here today.
He was apparently a very keen gymnast, and he was quite religious. He was very involved in the church, which was called New Court then, and is now called St Mellitus. So he left a huge family behind. His younger brother also served in the war, and one of his nephews served in the war as well. He didn't have a wife and child, though. He was unmarried at the time he fought. But again, that's very sad, because he didn't get to experience many of the things that, other people who grew up to be a decent age experience. And that happened to so many men in the First World War.
Walter Wallace was only 24 years old when he died in 1915. Tabitha Godfrey had 3 brothers who died in the First World War, and their names are listed on one of the plaques at St Mellitus.
Tabitha Godfrey, she's very interesting because, the women didn't fight in the First World War, but she was connected to lots of men who did. When I was looking into her family, they have, we've just had the census. So they had one just after she was born in 1891, and she appeared in that. And then she didn't appear in the next census, which was 10 years later. And I was wondering whether she and one of her brothers, who no longer appeared, had died very young because they weren't marked as part of the family. But amazingly, she turned up in another part of the census, and she was in hospital. And they built this hospital in 6 weeks to deal with an illness called scarlet fever. There was an outbreak of that, and lots of children were hospitalised there.
Tabitha worked as a servant for a local family. The family that she worked for ran a draper's shop that sold fabric, bedding and clothing. It's now a supermarket on Stroud Green Road. Leonard Poplar lived a short life and spent much of it away from his family.
He was born in the southwest of England, but his family moved to London when he was very young. He had a brother who was 10 years older. Basically, the father deserted the family. And very, very sadly, in 1907, 7 years before the war, Leonard appears. He's in an orphanage. And this is really interesting. He's in this orphanage in North London that has a connection to another school that still exists. And he was there for 6 years. So by the time he came out of that, he would still have been maybe 15. He'd have gone from the orphanage. He worked for briefly, and then as soon as he was 18, he signed up as a soldier.
Leonard ended up being sent to fight in Egypt as a reinforcement for the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. Sadly, Leonard died at sea when the transport ship he was on was torpedoed. He was one of 600 men who died when the ship went down. George Pocock was a young man from the parish of Newcourt, but there is limited information about him.
George Vincent Pocock is a bit of a mystery because, like so many people from the first part of the 20th century, we don't have many records about them, and particularly when they weren't very well off. So we know a little bit about his family, the Pococks. They lived in a street called Campbell Road. It was in Finsbury Park. It's no longer there because it was demolished. It was one of the very poor streets where 3 families lived in a house, 21 people in total. And in his family, there were his parents, his brother Joseph, who was known as Freddie, and 3 sisters and another brother. He became a soldier quite early in the war, and he fought on what is known as the Western Front in France and in Flanders, which is Belgium today. We know that he was wounded at one point, and people would have been taken, the soldiers would have been taken behind the front line to a casualty station and then to a hospital. But as soon as they were well, they were sent back to the front.
George was captured in France and then taken to a prisoner of war camp in northwest Germany, along with hundreds of other men. They were made to work in quarries, mines, farms and factories. In spite of the hardship in the camps, the soldiers did manage to make some entertainment. They set up a theatre and put on plays and performances. They also projected films on a screen, making their own cinemas, which was a new technology at the time. Percy Alford was one of 4 brothers who served in the First World War. 2 are listed on the plaques at St Mellitus.
Percy signed up in the British Army very quickly after the war was declared on the 4th of August. I think it was about 3 weeks later, joined the army, was sent off for training, as always happened to soldiers. And I don't think he liked it, because later in life, he said that he found them a rather rough lot. Doesn't sound as though he liked them. And he was very taken aback that lots of them couldn't read and write. He'd had a reasonable education as the standards at the time. After about 8 or 9 months, his father wrote a letter to the army saying that Percy had signed up without his father's permission, which he had indeed. He was only 16 when he signed up, and he pretended to be 17. And if you were under 17, you needed your parents' permission. So his father wrote and said, "Please, will you let Percy go? All my sons are fighting, and I don't want to lose this one at the front, the Western Front. He's my youngest. I don't want to lose him." So his father's letter was successful, and Percy was let go from the army after a very short time.
Percy then enlisted in the Royal Flying Corps, which later became the Royal Air Force. He served as a wireless operator and learnt how to send signals to other soldiers. He served in France and at one point was hurt in a gas attack and was sent to hospital to recover.
And for me, the saddest bit of Percy's story is that he was actually in the same hospital in northern France as his brother, who was in the Australian army and had also been gassed in an attack. And they didn't know that they were both there. And very sadly, his brother Alf died. And Percy didn't know that at the time.
Percy survived the war and came back home to England. The reason why we know a lot about Percy is because his granddaughter in Australia has shared precious family records, including his own written account of his life. This is an audio recording of Percy speaking about his favourite singer, Gracie Fields, who was sometimes a passenger in the taxi that he drove.
I often carried Gracie in the old taxi. Years ago, your mother and I once went to the Palladium to see her. We had a thoroughly good evening that time. Certainly does bring back memories.
The researchers discovered a lot about the Edwards family. They were a large family, and 10 of the male cousins fought in the First World War. 7 of them are commemorated by the organ at St Mellitus.
The Edwards family is fascinating because there are a lot of different branches. They're connected to each other as members of the family, but also through the church.
3 of the cousins joined the same battalion: Herbert, Cecil and Oscar. Sadly, Herbert died in an attack on the Western Front in 1915. Another cousin, Leslie, became a commissioned officer.
And when he was commissioned, he moved to a different regiment. He moved to the Loyal North Lancashires, who come from the northwest of England. So he would have been commanding a lot of men who didn't know his bit of North London, with whom he didn't have those bonds of family or community. But he was clearly a very good officer, and he was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry. His brother, Cecil, started out with Herbert and Oscar, but then he was wounded. He was one of the men who was quite badly wounded, and I would say, from what I've read, had a disability for the rest of his life.
10 cousins from the Edwards family fought in the First World War. 9 survived the war, and 1 sadly perished.